LaunchDarkly enables development and operations teams to deploy code at any time, even if a feature isn't ready to be released to users. Wrapping code with feature flags gives you the safety to test new features and infrastructure in your production environments without impacting the wrong end users. Learn more at launchdarkly.com.
Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. I'm Daniel Bryant, News Manager here at InfoQ and Director of DevRel at Ambassador Labs. In this edition of the InfoQ podcast, I had the pleasure of chatting with Mishra and Nic Jackson from HashiCorp. I've previously worked with Nic back in 2014 at the UK-based online retailer notonthehighstreet.com, where we were building platforms based on Apache Mesos and AWS. This is pre-Kubernetes. I've known Mishra for a long time via his open source work and his influence in HashiCorp. He's my go-to person for all things Vault and secret management. We've all been attending various online events over the past few months, such as HashiConf, KubeCon, and KubeCon+, and every time we bump into each other, we have fascinating conversations on topics such as the importance of cultivating developer workflows, building platforms using open source and cloud technologies, and how best to implement continuous delivery. This time, we decided to record the conversation. So, hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast, Mishra, Nic.
Hey, how you doing? It's great to speak to you, Daniel.
As always with you both too. Now, we've all been friends for a long time, but could you introduce yourself to the listeners, please?
Thank you so much, Daniel, for having us on the show. This is really a privilege. So my name is Mishra. I'm the technical advisor to the CTO at HashiCorp. I work in the office of CTO on strategic projects. This might involve partnering with major cloud providers on projects and also doing some open source work, some advocacy work. As part of this role, I get to look at emerging technology areas and see where they are relevant to HashiCorp. My background is in computer engineering. So I studied computer engineering in university. I've worked in operations engineering roles, also software engineering roles. So I kind of empathize with both developers and operators. Currently, right now, I'm in the process of writing a book called Getting Started with HashiCorp Vault. The book, it's tailored towards, kind of beginners into security and learning Vault. First few chapters of the book are out on LeanPub if anyone's interested. More recently, though, I've been involved in projects like CDK for Terraform and HashiCorp Waypoint. And both these projects are HashiCorp projects, which are fully open sourced.
I'm Nic Jackson. I'm a developer advocate here at HashiCorp. Before that, I was running engineering teams, software engineering, software development, great fun with distributed systems, written a book on microservices, and a little plug for next year. Got a book coming out on microservices, but specifically service mesh patterns and practices. So you'll be able to catch that on O'Reilly in the new year.
Super. So just to set the context, as you were talking there, Nic, like you and I have actually worked together in the past building platforms, and I've had many chats over the years with Mishra around the same topics. That's why we thought today would be a fantastic opportunity to explore some of these challenges. But could you both share your thoughts on the value a good platform provides to the ultimate goal we're all aiming for is delivering value to our end users, right?
So I think it's simple. And I think you've got to look at what your role is within the organization. Where do you derive value? And I would argue that you derive value from delivering unique functionality or features for the business. And I don't believe they are the platform, because what you tend to do, whilst you may think it's unique, I believe we're all involved in exactly the same action across every different organization, which is pretty much building the same platform when really we should be writing business functionality.
Yeah, I think I agree with Nic's take on that. Daniel, you and I have talked about this a lot, is that being at these really large conferences when we would meet at the expo floors and things like that, and I would look at you and I both were like, oh my God, there's so many things out there. And I feel like bringing all of these things into organizations that have a certain structure, a certain business goals, it always is difficult to kind of expose them in a way that's useful. A lot of people try to expose, 3 of the tools or technologies that might solve the same problem, but it is very inconsistent in organizations across different teams, people using different types of languages, especially in polyglot organizations. It's even more difficult because, certain teams are biased towards one language or the other. So I think a platform, it really brings in a lot of key pieces that would help maybe standardize some of this exposing of technology that's useful for a business org. I think that's the main goal, right? And what that solves is, developers writing code, not worrying about, how we are doing some complex network routing or how are we exposing a key value store into the organization. That's someone else's issue.
And just to clarify as well, because I just been sitting there listening to Mishra and realizing that, wow, did I just give a really clickbaity statement in my opening thing there? There's two things around this. One is that the last thing I did before leaving my last job was set up a platform team. And I also believe that there is a very good reason why we're all building platforms. And that's because nobody else has provided one for us. And I'm hoping we're going to get into chat about that because I've got some pretty good opinions on that.
I think that's a perfect setup, Nick. So my next question was going to be, what does a modern platform look like? And I'll frame it for the listeners by saying a lot of us talk about platform as a service, the classics, right? Heroku, Cloud Foundry. I've definitely sort of pushed back at them at times, thinking they're a cookie cutter, one size fit all type thing. I've actually come to realize the value of these things more and more now. Heroku is actually awesome, right? I may have pushed back on it. But what do you both think that are the quintessential elements, if you like, of a modern platform, modern PaaS?
I think the first thing is that it's beyond just running an application. And I think there's some incredibly good tools. I mean, Google Cloud Run, I think, is a wonderful tool. AWS has got some great stuff going on with Lambda if you want to take the kind of the serverless side. Azure's got some great stuff going on with Container Engine, there's sort of container storage and running container instances. DigitalOcean's just launched a really great little platform which allows you to run containers and databases and things like that. But I think platform is more than just running the container. It encompasses the entire of the developer workflow from deployment of the code, potentially even the application framework that you're using, and also right through the end stack from sort of providing insights into how the application's running.
Yeah, I agree with Nick. And I think the thing that always excited me about building platforms, I guess I didn't go that back in my background, but I was an operations engineer and I've been a software engineer as well. So I've seen both sides of this wall that we talk about a lot in DevOps. And we did end up building platforms on multiple different schedulers, for example, Mesos to start off with, and then we went into Kubernetes and things like that. But we were also using multiple Amazon web services at my previous job for maybe just for doing some pub sub and doing some event streaming and things like that. And that was fine as well. So for me, what's exciting about platforms is it's an opportunity to harmonize some of these things that happen that might be really good for certain use cases, but may or may not work for other use cases. So you kind of pick and choose like the 95% in your company. So what would be that 95% that can get the job done for pretty much everyone that's in the organization? And I think it's a lot more than technology. It's a lot more about people coming to an agreement and what that service contract is and creating that service contract, creating what that service template or whatever you want to call it looks like. And once you have agreement, it actually becomes beautiful. And we saw this in organizations previously, at least what I worked with a bunch of people, we were a really small team. But somehow we got the right people, key stakeholders together and asked them to, come to an agreement. And luckily we did. And, we really started off the microservices journey with the right foot forward. And the interesting thing about platforms is that once you have that kind of consensus and you have that interface to kind of really create services. And as Nick pointed out, that it's beyond just containers, it could be other things, right? It could be, certain applications require you to run, on a dedicated machine. Certain applications, it's much better to just consume the cloud provider's, version of it and things like that. So once you have that really clean interface, you can swap things in the background and people shouldn't worry about it. And this is one of the things that I really loved in my previous job, that we went from Mesos to Kubernetes with minimum disruption to people. I think I've given a KubeCon talk about this. The title was really clickbaity, I guess. It was like moving from Mesos to Kubernetes without anyone noticing. That was the title of the talk. You can search it. But, the idea was to kind of seamlessly move from things. But we had that pass in front of the scheduler. We didn't really leak those details down to the developer. And that really helped us in the overall establishing a standard at the company.
I think that's a super important thing about a platform. I think as a developer, you should have mechanical sympathy of the infrastructure that you're running on, but you should also be abstracted away from its dependency, like Mishra was just explaining, and having the ability to port your app from one version of a platform to another is actually really important.
And I'm 100% on board with what you gents are both saying. One pushback I have had is folks sort of almost trying to standardize the lowest common denominator. I see this with data stores a lot, right? It's like I could use some Amazon, Azure, Google, pick your poison, right? I could use one of those, but I'm actually going to put a layer of abstraction or a facade on top because I don't want any of this leaking through. And I'm like, think of the business use case here. Are you really going to migrate away from that? So I'm totally playing devil's advocate.
Yeah.
But I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So I can say that how old am I now? I've been working in the industry 25 years this year.
Too old. Too old.
Yes, exactly. And I need to retire. You're absolutely right. But regardless, right? In 25 years, I could count on zero hands the number of times that I've actively migrated an application from one database to another. I've never done it. And I'm not saying that's the case for everybody, but I think it's a fairly sort of unique use case. I mean, the thing is, if you're bound to, say, MySQL or Postgres or Elasticache or Redis or something like that from an application integration perspective, if you're running on GCP or if you're running on Azure or if you're running on AWS, all of those clouds have got no problem in providing you a Postgres or a MySQL compatible database. So do you need that interface in your app layer? I don't know. The reason I kind of question that is I find that sometimes that complexity adds to the cognitive load of the developer as opposed to simplifying it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think this is an interesting question. Rather than giving some really complex analogy, I'll just give you a practical example, right? So let's say you do choose Amazon as your cloud platform. Let's say your organization does have the pedigree to go multi-cloud and, you do want that redundancy for some reason. For example, you might think that, Google's ML services are better. So you're like, okay, we're using Google's ML services. We're going to be our containers and, Java applications are going to run on AWS. And you end up choosing, let's say Aurora, which is really amazing SQL service on a managed SQL service on Amazon. And it gives you really good performance. You don't need to run a cache in front of it. It's really, really nice. And it's cost efficient for your use case. And it's giving you the performance that you need. Do you really want to abstract that? And then say at some point, what would happen is we might move to on-prem and we might need to basically replicate the same service on-prem with the same type of SLA. It's kind of impossible to do, right? It's very, very difficult for you. Yes, you could move to a different cloud with a similar service. But even then, I think, most services that are managed, they give you so much more if you directly use them without any interface and so on. But I think to that, what I say is that, okay, if you can avoid using a driver in your application code that the managed service is offering, so that way you can at least don't have the code where you need to migrate the code at this point if you move, right? At least you're clean there. You don't have anything that's leaking from the cloud provider in your code base. I think that actually prevents you from some of these issues. But I think you can kind of find a happy medium. But at certain points, you might need to just use the service as is and not actually try to apply. I think that's just too complicated at that point.
But I've just had a thought, though, because I think with databases, I'm still going to maintain what I just said. But then what I'm thinking is, what if it's secret or a piece of configuration or an event? I think maybe that's slightly different because I don't think you're dealing with standards anymore. The event bus that runs on SQS is different from Google's PubSub and stuff like that. I think if you're running multi-cloud, then it might make sense to have abstraction.
There is abstractions available, Nick, like cloud events jumps to mind. I was chatting to the Trigger Mesh folks and a bunch of other folks. So there is sort of often those abstractions.
There's a lot of great stuff there, cloud events from tracing and stuff like that. You've got open tracing, open telemetry, which gives you the necessary interfaces. But at the same time, I think moving from one cloud to another is, again, it's not something that people take lightly. So I think it's back to value. Where is the value? And I think you've got to ask yourself that question when you're sizing up a piece of work. And ultimately, you should be looking for the answer, which is the thing that kind of gives my business an uptick, which could be abstraction. Maybe it is a multi-cloud solution. That could be the thing. But you've got to ask the question, where is the value?
Something I learned in my role as an architect is asking the right questions, right? Looking at the right trade-offs, that is a key thing because for every rule, there's an exception pretty much, right? And I think you're saying, Nick, depending on what your business prop is and what the skills of your team are and your resources, weigh all those things up and then make a decision, right? That's the key thing, isn't it? Actually, as we were talking there, I was thinking about a couple of things I wanted to lead into. Hearing you talk, Mishra, and I was thinking about Terraform. Right? I remember when I first learned Terraform, I was like, hang on, all the cloud stuff's different, but the workflow's the same. Yeah. And I remember when I learned, I got it. And I was teaching my team when I was at Open Credo working. And they were like, but all these things are so different. And I was like, no. The magic here is not in the stanzas for the different clouds. The magic is a consistent workflow. And I think we've skirted around it here, but I think it's somewhat the same for the platform, right? The magic is a consistent workflow, whether you're using Heroku or, Cloud Foundry. Again, got to be careful with the lowest common denominator here, but a consistent workflow for your use case, I'm guessing you would both think is really important, right?
And I think Terraform's a great example on, so why don't we have a lowest common denominator of virtual machine? And the answer is, it would be incredibly difficult to maintain that level of abstraction across tens and tens and tens of clouds, it would be almost impossible because the way that those machines work is very different. Some people attach interfaces to machines, some are on NICs, machines are attached to interfaces. It's kind of like you would have to have that deep knowledge and it would be brittle and it wouldn't really add any value, I think. So I think the key absolutely is in the workflow.
Absolutely. And then I think the one thing to note with Terraform is, workflow is a big one. But I think the second thing is just the plugin ecosystem and being able to create your own plugin, right? Like, so let's say you completely disagree with this take that I think I stand with as well, which is like really difficult to create the generic VM for like 3 clouds, 4 clouds, even 1 cloud, to be honest with you, because these primitives move quite quickly. So you can always write a plugin which pertains to your implementation of whatever those cloud APIs for you are. And that might be on-prem, that might be OpenStack APIs that you might be, using directly. It could be anything. It could be vSphere or anything like that. And you can totally do that. Or you could use another way of kind of bringing things together, which is modules. So you can kind of bring in things with a library style way where you have a module for your web server implementation, and that might be on any cloud. It might only expose like 3 or 4 knobs, and that's what really maybe developer needs, and you're off to the races, basically.
I always liked those types of abstractions, Mishra, as well. Like as an engineer, having those domain-specific abstractions in my organization, it just kind of exposes what you need rather than needing to know a huge amount and trying to figure out which dial I've got to turn. I really like those types of things.
I like your mention, Mishra, so the plugins, as in that's something that's not always obviously jumping out to me with Terraform, but it is super strong. And I think you can make the same argument for the value of plugins for the dev workflow, right? I think it's the Weaveworks team doing the GitOps toolkit. I know HashiCorp have got Waypoint. There seems to be this culmination of ideas at the moment around this workflow is really important. This kind of, build, test, deploy, release, get feedback. But we don't all want to do exactly the same thing at every step. So I'd love to hear both your thoughts on the value of kind of a plugin model if it applies to those steps of a dev workflow.
Absolutely. I guess we can talk about Waypoint first. For those of you who are listening, Waypoint is something that HashiCorp introduced this year in our annual conference, which was digital this year, which is unfortunate. We really love to host people. But we announced 2 new projects, and one of them is Waypoint. And the idea here is to kind of give a consistent workflow, which involves building, deploying, and releasing across like multiple platforms, different clouds, different type of platform. For example, Daniel, you mentioned Heroku and things like that. And also like give you some of the tools like, validating your deployment. And also the key pillar here is the plugins, right? The idea is to make the plugin development really, really easy and for you to kind of extend the project for your own needs, for your own platform, for your own environment. And I think that's kind of the premise here, right? And the plugin model is pretty much what we've learned from Terraform over the years, which you kind of see the Terraform has a very vibrant provider community, which is basically the plugins. And means in this case, being specific to application deployment here. And Nic is the perfect person to talk about plugin development because he worked a lot on Waypoint on that one particular focus. So Nic, I'll let you take it on.
Yeah, I think it's super important because we're talking about the workflow. You've got to give people the ability to define extension. And you mentioned Weave, and I super dig Weave. I think some of the tooling that they've produced specifically around popularization of the concept of GitOps, Flagger, tools like that, I think are incredible. And what we want to do with Waypoint, we don't want to compete with that. What we want to do is be able to allow people to integrate with that. So it's following that classic Tao principle, workflows, not technologies, even our own technologies, right? So Waypoint has a rich plugin ecosystem, which allows you to integrate, say, something like Flagger, or maybe you want to integrate with Google Container Engine. Maybe you want to do some Lambda or Kubernetes, or maybe you've got a very bespoke internal system that exists and you want to do some integration with that. Well, you can write your own plugin to integrate with your own system. So it's fully extensible because what we want to do is help you with the workflow rather than force you down to choosing a section of technology.
Changing gears a little bit, I'm really curious to dive into things that get ignored often in the workflow. And for me at the moment, it's observability and security, right? Observability is completing the loop for me. I see a lot of folks talk about continuous delivery, but there's no mention of actually completing the feedback loop, looking at your KPIs, looking at your SLIs and feeding back. And security, it's like, as unfortunately we're seeing in the news, like throughout this year, it's a big issue for us, and software is everywhere. And I think, we here as professionals, we recognize like the responsibility is increasingly falling hard on our shoulders. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how developers would benefit from thinking more about security observability in the workflow.
So security, I think, for the majority, I'm going to make another controversial statement by saying it's not people's primary concern. And the reason that I say that is because security is super important. Everybody knows it is. But when you're fighting fires in your application, it's the thing that you can't immediately get at. Now, I think with security as well, that a lot of security should just be done for you. It should be automated as much as possible. You've got tooling which allows you to do scanning. Why can't we have systems which just deploy applications and configure the platform in a secure way? And I think we're getting towards that. Observability is also quite hard. I mean, getting metrics out of a system which maybe doesn't naturally emit metrics is not that easy, but it's incredibly important. So I think those are the two areas that we really need to get better at automating. I think those are the two things which shouldn't have to think about to a greater extent. It should be something you're aware of, but it should be something that the platform manages for you. I'm not a security expert. I've got an appreciation of what the risks are, but I'm by no means an expert. I really need somebody to help me with these things, and it could be the platform that does that.
I think that's why you see kind of the rise in, for example, that it does explain the rise in, things like service meshes and stuff like that. They do give you end-to-end MTLS and things like that. That's why I think what Nic is saying is that, it's not your primary concern. You want the environment that your app is running in to do that for you. And the interesting thing is, the more people move to cloud, it's like an entitlement that you kind of almost claim, and you say like, I'm running in the cloud, I should be secure since, I'm running behind all these firewalls and things like that. But that's not always true, right? We all kind of know that, right? All the primitives are there though. Like the cloud has all the primitives to do that. So I think the idea is for something to configure it in the right way so that you can make use of them, basically.
And again, to kind of clarify, we've been here. We've been in a situation where we know that our security, personally speaking, is not optimal. But we've got the question of the application needs to be stable for, say, Black Friday. Now, I can only do one thing. Do I look at fixing security when there is a risk that I might not get hacked or I might not be compromised? Or do I fix the application when the application I know will go down? So I think a lot of people are working with trade-offs and choices, and I'm not saying that avoiding security concerns is the right thing to do. It's not. But you've got to make choices. You've got to take balance. And when you don't have unlimited time and unlimited abilities to fix things, more often than not, the risk is lower than other priorities, even though rightly or wrongly.
No, I hear you, Nic. It's again, as an information technology professional, it is about trade-offs, right? I think that's the number one thing, and being very honest and upfront and documenting and sharing at the right level those trade-offs. Because sometimes I think that doesn't happen. I've seen that in my career. Sometimes it does, and the folks still make the wrong decisions. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's just recognizing it, I think, and so forth is really, really key, right?
Back at the original one, it's just something we shouldn't have to deal with.
I like Mishra's mention of service mesh because I'm all in the service mesh space these days. I think the security, like the MTLS, is super interesting. I think also secret storage is really important. And Mishra, Nic has already done a shout out for his book. I've got to do a shout out for your book, right?
Yeah, I do have a book coming out. It's a getting started book. Funny enough, I started writing with Nic, and Nic has a lot to do in terms of like the early chapters of the book here. So you'll see some of Nic's writing in my book as well, which is great. I do give him the acknowledgement, and he does get the shout out. So yeah, Don't hate on me.
I apologize for any readers. I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's going to be a great book, Mishra. I mean, I think security is so important. I mean, if I was a CTO or a CIO, it would literally be top of my agenda because security is the thing that could absolutely just wipe your business out.
Black swan event type thing, isn't it? Where, like overnight, it's boom, like, yeah. We're seeing it now. I won't name names, but we're seeing it actually as we record a podcast. Like folks can look back through the calendar and figure out where that was, but we're seeing these kind of things like, yeah.
I mean, cost to reputation, just the pure sort of financial cost in terms of penalties and sort of regulatory concerns. It's super huge. And this is genuinely one of the things I get excited about Service Mesh. You mentioned Service Mesh and a lot of people groan, and I don't know why. Like, Service Mesh, is it just because it's like really markety or really buzzy, or is it because of the thing that everybody's talking about? But it helps me. I mean, configuring MTLS between services is no mean feat. Like locking down the traffic between two services to avoid lateral movement of an attack is not an easy thing to do. Even using things like Kubernetes network policies and stuff, it's not easy. Like the service mesh gives you that for free, and it gives you it really easily with like very, very simple policy-based concerns. So it kind of handles some of the security that I don't need to think about. And it's a pretty big part of it. Having a vulnerability is one thing, but if you look at any of the attacks which have happened recently, it's not necessarily the vulnerable service which has been the cause of the loss of data or whatever. It's been the ability that the attacker has jumped off from that point deeper into the system. And securing that is difficult, especially in dynamic environments when you've got a lot of moving parts and routing tables can't be static and machines are changing IP addresses all of the time. And you've got multi-tenancy and multi-layers of application sort of networking insides of Kubernetes and stuff like that. Service Mesh really just gives you that for free if you only use it for that alone. And that's a big deal. And then there's observability. But if you've got another half an hour, I can rant about that as well.
Yeah, I know.
Awesome stuff. As we're coming up to time there, Jens, I'd love to give a quick take for the final few minutes of what do you think is going to be super interesting in the space we've talked about today over the next, say, 5 years, right? Looking into the crystal ball a little bit as we're approaching the new year or in the new year when the podcast is published. What do you think folks should be looking at? What do you think super interesting? Yeah, where do you think the developer experience, we're all developers or to some degree here, where do you think that's going to go in, say, 5 years' time?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think you've got to look at the past. Now, you can call me an absolute Luddite, but anybody who's worked with frameworks like Spring, who worked with platforms like PCF back in the day and think about the developer experience that was given to you then, I think we need to build that type of framework for the developer, the types of platform, and bring them towards the way that we're building massively distributed multi-cloud systems. So I'd like to see that. And I think we'll get that within 5 years.
I hope so. I really hope so. Because I think this has been one of my gripes for the past 3 years, at least, like it's just been so difficult to do software. Like it used to be so easy. It used to be like FTP my PHP file on the server and like it's not the best, but it worked. And, live edit things on the production server, like, and then save. And as soon as you hit save, it was online. And I think the experience was great. The way we went about it, it's of course completely wrong in today's world. Like I think we have better tools to do all of those type of things. But I think the experience that the developer got at that point of being able to write something really quickly, maybe fix a production outage or something like that, and being able to go through the step of building and deploying it and releasing it safely. And then what you said, Daniel, which is to grab the logs or like the telemetry or like the, being able to observe the application in a consistent way per deployment, right? Like per deployment. That's really important here, right? I think those are the type of things I want to see from either the frameworks or some abstraction that someone builds. But I hope we get there faster because the rate at which we are creating new things to do the same job, it's way up there compared to the rate at which we are creating good platforms that actually hide some of this complexity from people.
I remember when I first started my career and somebody say, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I'm a C# developer or I'm a Java developer. These days, it's like, oh, what do you do? It's like, well, I'm a Go developer, but I'm also a Docker expert and I'm pretty dab-handed GitHub Actions. And I know a bunch of stuff about configuring Prometheus and writing Grafana queries. And oh, I'm an expert with Kibana logs and Kubernetes. Yeah, I know all about Kubernetes, configuring it, and I can do Terraform and I can define clouds. Or a bunch of stuff around make files. I mean, like I know make inside out. And that's just one build system. It's really hard. If you come into this industry now as a graduate developer, and then it's like, okay, great, you know how to program, you're a great programmer, now go learn this other 500,000 different things.
I'm just going to say good luck to them. Just good luck. From me, I don't even explain. I just like, you know what, you're going to find out in the next 1 hour. So good luck to you.
It's genuinely tricky. And like, one thing I'm very privileged to, and I think we're all the same here, is coming up from like CGI. You mentioned PHP, Mishra, I did Perl, all this kind of stuff, right? I've literally lived it. Like, I had my first computer when I was 10. So I think it's a massive privilege. Like, it's much easier for me to build mental models. I've heard Kelsey Hightower talk about this. We all love Kelsey stuff. But he was often saying, like, as advice, like, if you want to know about Envoy, about proxies, learn about Nginx, learn about the history, the simplicity, the birth of the tech, because everything good is transferable between the generations, right? we're just building it. And when he said that, like, it was one of those classic Kelsey pithy tweet. And I was like, you're on point again, Kelsey. I'm going to save that one because I'm chatting to people I'm mentoring and I realize they don't have all the context that I've got from like 20 plus years of IT experience, right?
And I kind of like saying this earlier, but I really think that we do take one step backwards when we move 2 steps forward. And I think at the moment where we are now, we made 2 steps forward into getting to distributed systems, but we did take 1 back around the developer experience and developer workflow.
One giant leap back, right?
It seems to take time for the tools to catch up with the patterns and the architectural practices, which I think we're getting there.
And someone told me this like really early in my career is like, you're going to see this pendulum swing, right, of technology. So it goes one way, pretty extreme, pretty hard, and then comes back to the same point. And it's so true, right? Like, I think we've reinvented packaging. I don't know how many times. It's just like apt to like, RPM stuff to, jar files to, using virtual env things and like, isolating environments like that, and then containers, and then you're back to like files. Like, it's just like, I don't understand, where does this stop? Like, hopefully eventually, like, we do concede and say that, okay, this is okay for us for now,
One thing which I think I really have to say I don't miss, and that is XML.
As a recovering Java developer, I can definitely echo that. When I was doing Spring, it was all about the XML. Now I'm doing some Spring Boot today. It's annotation driven these days. And I'm like, this is awesome. Right?
Spring's done really well. I'm very impressed with the way that Spring has continued to evolve over the years, and kind of like everybody's worked well. The trend is Go and maybe Rust and Node and things like that. There's a lot to be said about a mature language like Java and a really, really good framework like Spring.
Oh, plus one that, Nick. On that note, gents, we're coming out to time. Perfect ending, I think. We've covered a lot of great stuff here. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Daniel. It's a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us, Daniel.